Hi there, welcome to Long Distance Review, and on this week's episode I'm going to look at the new album from Deftones entitled Ohms. Deftones were formed way back in 1988 and they've had a huge 32-year career, but really they only came into the spotlight, let's say, in around 1995 when they released their debut album entitled Adrenaline, and then followed up in 1997 with the album Around the Fur. At this point in time they were kind of unfairly lumped in, baffling now when you look back really, but they were lumped in with the new metal genre. Mainly because the new metal genre at that point in time was so popular that everyone kind of got lumped into it and everyone was trying to do it. Although there were new metal elements, let's say, on the first couple of Deftones albums, it was pretty obvious when they released their third album, White Pony, in the year 2000 that there was a lot more to Deftones. White Pony was an incredible album, still one of my favourite albums of all time, and it really showcased what the band could do. They went into more experimental, ambient, prog territory while sticking to this sort of alternative rock blueprint that they had formed. And since then really they've never looked back, and there's not many heavy metal bands or alternative rock bands that have had a career as long as the Deftones and have been as consistent as the Deftones. They've never really dipped into bad territory, let's say, or poor territory. They're just varying degrees of greatness in my eyes. No bad albums at all, just ones that are better than others, but they're all really good. This will be their 9th studio album, their first since 2016's Gore. Gore was an album which kind of split fans. It was released with quite a lot of critical acclaim, and there's a bit of a myth around that album that there was no guitars on it, and it was all just like Steph Carpenter wasn't involved in the writing of it, and it was just not, he didn't like it, he didn't play, he wasn't allowed to play his guitars on it and things, which really is out of context to what he actually said. And if you look back at that album, I think you'll realise that there was a lot more on there than people think. It was a very easy thing to say, and a very popular thing to end up saying by going, I don't really like Gore, there's no guitars on it, it's not very heavy. There are some heavy stuff on there, I think it's a fantastic album. Anyway, that's Gore. So this is the first album since 2016. And also this is the first album that Deftones have done with producer Terry Date since their first 4 albums of their career. The last time they worked with Terry Date was on the 2008 Eros Sessions, which was an album that they ended up scrapping because of the tragic circumstances around the album when bassist Chi Cheng passed away eventually following a horrendous car crash. So those albums were scrapped, and since then Deftones haven't worked with Terry Date. So this must have been really tough for them to get back in the studio for the first time with a producer that they hadn't worked with since this sort of really troubling period of their career. So that aside, let's get on to the album itself. The album opens up with the song Genesis, with these great atmospheric synths opening up before this brick heavy concrete slab of a guitar tone comes in, and this fantastic vocal display from Chino where he's sort of screeching and bending his voice. The guitar tone across this whole album is heavy, the vocals are raw and emotive at times, and the pace is furious at points in time. And what I will say about Deftones is what I've always loved about them is this sort of yin and yang effect they have. It's this Chino Moreno and Steph Carpenter yin and yang thing, which, as their chief songwriters of the band, it's a bit of a myth again that Steph is the one that likes the heavy metal stuff and Chino is the one that likes the ambient stuff, when if you look back in their career, especially on albums like White Pony, and look at the songwriting credits, you'll realise that that isn't necessarily true. On this album, as always, Chino's lyrics have been very ambiguous. There's no different on here really, but there is a lot of talk, especially on the opening track Genesis, of a resurgence, a resolve, looking ahead, and there's also a lot of talk about time right at the end of the album of looking back. There's a bit of a theme evolving around this album at times. There is a more obvious lyrical direction on the third track, a track called Urantia, which is an absolute glorious track, where it's seemingly Chino mourning a sort of breakup he'd had in the past, and Chino sounding very Billy Corgan-esque, let's say, especially on the outstanding chorus on that track. It has these beautiful synths surrounded by these buzzing and humming guitar tone. And it's almost like at times Deftones, I think the best way to describe it is feels like a battle between the instruments at times. You've got the synths and drums and bass and guitars and Chino all vying and pushing and pulling around, and at times it feels like the band are all just going to collapse, but somehow it sits perfectly harmoniously with each other. And I think that's the best way I can describe the Deftones. And this push and pull is what kind of makes the Deftones the most interesting, fascinating band that they are. And this album really personifies that completely. Chino has this really great talent of being emotive with his voice without being obvious with his lyrics, and it's no different on here. His voice cracking at times, breaking, almost failing on him at times before soaring again. There's a song on here called The Spell of Mathematics, which feels like a nightmarish dream at times, sort of showcasing the more ambient and dreamy side of the band that we saw more on Gore, let's say, before descending. The track sort of then descends down this black hole of effects and bass effects, which I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed that track. I think my favourite part of the album though is right in the middle. There's this double hit of songs called Pompeii and This Link Is Dead. Pompeii starts with this almost ambient and acoustic-y type verse with these seagull sounds and waves crashing around you, and Chino's voice really beautiful at times before the chorus comes in with this soul-crushing heavy chorus that really jars the listener, lurches them to attention. I love that song. And then the end of that song segues with this sort of sci-fi segue into the track called This Link Is Dead. And This Link Is Dead is a furious number, and it's Chino's most unhinged vocal display that he's done for some time. The album is a real tight 10-track affair. It feels, although it is similar in length to a lot of the other Deftones albums, this feels a lot more concise, a lot more focused, and I think that's why it flies by, because before you know it, you're kind of at the end of the album. There's a couple of tracks left and you think, Jesus, where did that go? It just flies by. I think there's a less meandering on this album than before maybe, and the band really feel together as one, totally focused on where they're going with this album. And I think that is the reason why this album just feels better, and it feels more focused, and it feels more directive than before. We get to the album closer, the title track, which was the single off the album entitled Ohms, and I think you've all heard that song, and I love how it's built around that great buzzsawing riff of Steph's, and it sort of builds and drops really, really beautiful. I love that song. I always have. When it came out, I was really hooked into it straight away. Overall, this album is a very heavy Deftones album. If you like the heavier side of Deftones, you will love this album. I don't like to always use the word heavy, because heavy can mean a lot of different things in terms of music. But this album is also very cinematic, very beautiful at times, as the Deftones have always been. And I think that this album sits in that perfect middle ground that Deftones have forged for themselves throughout their career, between this ambient, proggy side of the band and this heavy side of the band. It will take time to listen to this, like with all Deftones albums. You need to consume it over a period of months, and I feel you'll get a lot more out of it. At first listen though, this is probably the best they've sounded in my eyes since Diamond Eyes, but I'll have another look in a few months. I love this album, I love this band, and this will definitely be high up in the end of the year list, no doubt about that. Let me know what you think of the album, and I'll be back soon with another review. Thanks very much.